What if I told you there are entire civilizations, kingdoms with armies, universities, trade networks, architectural masterpieces that have been systematically left out of the history books you were handed in school? Not because historians didn't know about them, because certain people decided you shouldn't. When European colonizers arrived in Africa, they did not find a continent of darkness. They found kingdoms, they found cities, they found courts and councils, scholars and architects, merchants and mathematicians. And they had a problem, because their entire justification for conquest, their entire moral framework for enslaving millions of human beings and seizing an entire continent, rested on the idea that Africans had never built anything worth preserving, that they had no history, no civilization, no claim to the land or the future. If that story was going to hold, certain truths had to disappear. Today, we are going to bring those truths back. We are going to walk through some of the greatest kingdoms Africa ever produced, kingdoms that rivaled and in many cases surpassed anything in the contemporary world. And we are going to explain exactly how and why they were erased. This is the history they buried. And today, we dig it up. Before we get to the kingdoms themselves, we need to understand how erasure works, because it is not as simple as burning books, though that happened too. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, wrote in his 1830 work on the philosophy of history that Africa was, in his words, no historical part of the world. He stated that sub-Saharan Africa had no movement, no development, and that what we understand as history, as progress, had simply never occurred there. Hegel had never been to Africa. He was not writing history. He was constructing ideology. And that ideology, that Africa was a blank slate, a continent without history or civilization, became the intellectual foundation for European colonialism. Once that framework was in place, erasure happened through several channels, and it is important to name them clearly. The first was physical destruction. When colonizers encountered evidence of great African civilizations, cities, monuments, written records, they often destroyed them or attributed them to non-African origins. Great Zimbabwe was claimed by Rhodesian colonists to have been built by ancient Phoenicians or by the Queen of Sheba, or by anyone other than indigenous Bantu-speaking Africans. Anyone who suggested otherwise was professionally discredited. The second channel was looting. Tens of thousands of African cultural artifacts, sculptures, manuscripts, ceremonial objects, royal regalia, were taken from their places of origin and placed in European museums, private collections, and churches. Removed from context, they became curiosities rather than evidence of civilization. Britain alone holds over 900,000 African objects in its museums. The third channel was academic gatekeeping. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, African history as a serious academic discipline simply did not exist in European or American universities. There were no chairs in African history, no peer-reviewed journals, no funding. The scholars who did study African civilizations, most of them African themselves, were systematically marginalized, dismissed, or ignored. It was only in the mid-20th century, largely driven by African independence movements and scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and John Henrik Clarke of the United States, that African history began to be treated as a legitimate field of serious study. With all of that context established, let us now meet the kingdoms. Most people, if they know anything about ancient civilization in Northeast Africa, know Egypt, the pharaohs, the pyramids, the Nile. Far fewer know about the civilization that directly preceded, rivaled, outlasted, and at its height, actually conquered Egypt. The Kingdom of Kush. Kush, also known as Nubia, was a civilization that developed along the Upper Nile in what is now northern Sudan and southern Egypt, beginning as early as 2500 BCE. It was, in many periods, every bit as sophisticated as Egypt, and in many respects, it was older. The relationship between Egypt and Kush was one of the most dynamic in the ancient world. sometimes trade partners, sometimes rivals, sometimes conquerors, and conquered, with the balance of power shifting across the centuries. But here is the part of the story that almost never makes it into Western textbooks. Around 747 BCE, a Kushite king named Piye led his armies northward, swept through the Egyptian kingdoms that had fragmented in the Third Intermediate Period, and became the ruler of all Egypt. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, which ruled for approximately 100 years, was Kushite. These were black African pharaohs, originating from what is now Sudan, who unified a fractured Egypt, restored its temples, revived its artistic traditions, and presided over a cultural renaissance that Egyptologists have acknowledged as one of the most significant in Egyptian history. Their names were Piye, Shabaka, Taharka, and Tantamani. Taharka in particular is mentioned in the Bible, in the Book of Kings and the Book of Isaiah, as a powerful ally of the Israelites against the Assyrians. After the Assyrian invasions pushed the Kushites back south, the kingdom did not collapse. It retreated to its heartland and continued for another 1,000 years. Its capital moved to Meroe, which became one of the great cities of the ancient world, a center of iron production so advanced that scholars now believe the Iron Age technology that spread across sub-Saharan Africa may have originated there. Meroe also developed its own writing system, Meroitic script, which has still not been fully deciphered. A civilization advanced enough to develop its own alphabet in its own language that we still have not fully cracked. And yet, ask the average person anywhere in the world to name an ancient African civilization, and they will say Egypt, almost never Kush, almost never Nubia, almost never the civilization that built more pyramids than Egypt. Yes, Sudan has more ancient pyramids than Egypt, and ruled the Nile Valley for 3,000 years. Why is Kush erased? Because acknowledging Kush means acknowledging that black Africans built and ruled one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. And for an ideology built on African inferiority, that is not a story that could be allowed to stand. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, a Persian writer compiled a list of the 4 greatest kingdoms in the known world. He named Rome, Persia, China, and the 4th, Aksum, not Greece, not India, Aksum. This was not a marginal kingdom. This was a superpower. The Kingdom of Aksum, based in the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was at its height between the 1st and 7th centuries CE. It controlled trade routes connecting the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, Egypt, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Its merchants traded in gold, ivory, incense, and slaves across 3 continents. Aksum minted its own coins, in gold, silver, and bronze, which circulated across the ancient world. The presence of Aksumite coins has been documented in India, Arabia, and throughout the Mediterranean. A state that mints internationally circulated currency is, by any definition, a global economic power. In the 4th century CE, the Aksumite king Ezana converted to Christianity and made it the official religion of the state, making Aksum one of the very first Christian kingdoms in the entire world. This was around 330 CE, roughly the same time as the Roman Emperor Constantine. The Aksumites were also engineers of extraordinary capability. They quarried, transported, and erected granite obelisks, stelae, some of them over 30 meters tall and weighing 500 tons, using technology that is still not fully understood. One of those obelisks was stolen by Italian fascist forces under Mussolini in 1937 and taken to Rome, where it stood for 68 years before finally being returned to Ethiopia in 2005. Aksum also had a profound connection to the origins of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad's first followers, persecuted in Mecca, sought refuge in Aksum, and the Aksumite king, known as the Negus, protected them. This is documented in Islamic tradition and is the reason Ethiopia holds a unique and honored place in early Islamic history. An empire that shaped both early Christianity and early Islam, that was ranked alongside Rome and Persia, that traded with India and minted gold coins, and yet most people outside of Ethiopia and Eritrea have never heard of it. That is not an accident. In the English language, Timbuktu has become a byword for remoteness. for the back of beyond, for nowhere. This is perhaps the most elegant example of colonial erasure in everyday language, because in the 14th century, Timbuktu was one of the most important cities on earth. The Mali Empire, which reached its zenith under Emperor Mansa Musa in the early 1300s, controlled the gold and salt trade of West Africa, the two most valuable commodities in the medieval world. Its territory was larger than Western Europe. Its population numbered in the tens of millions. Its capital, Niani, and its intellectual center, Timbuktu, were among the most prosperous and sophisticated cities anywhere on the planet. Mansa Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the most documented events in medieval world history because of the sheer scale of its economic impact. He traveled with a caravan of 60,000 people, including 12,000 enslaved servants, and distributed so much gold along the route that he caused a decade-long inflation in the gold markets of Cairo, Medina, and the entire Mediterranean basin. Economists who have attempted to calculate Mansa Musa's wealth in modern terms have arrived at figures ranging from $400 billion to over $1 trillion. He is, by most serious assessments, the wealthiest individual in recorded human history. But what is less discussed, and more important, is what Mali built with that wealth. Timbuktu's Sankore University was fully operational by the 12th century. At its peak, it enrolled approximately 25,000 students from across Africa, the Arab world and beyond, in a city of roughly 100,000 people. That is a higher ratio of university students to total population than most modern cities. Those students studied theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, and law. The libraries of Timbuktu held between 300,000 and 1 million manuscripts. Many of them were deliberately hidden by local families when European colonialists arrived, buried in the sand, sealed in clay jars, concealed in cellars, to protect them from destruction. Descendants of those families are still working today to recover and preserve those manuscripts. When someone uses Timbuktu as a word for nowhere, they are, without knowing it, repeating colonial propaganda, and now you know better. In 1910, the German archaeologist Leo Frobenius was excavating in the Yoruba city of Ife, in what is now southwestern Nigeria. He discovered a series of bronze and terracotta sculptures, human heads of extraordinary naturalistic precision. The features were lifelike. The casting was technically flawless. The artistry was, by any standard, breathtaking. His response? He declared that these works could not possibly have been made by Africans. He attributed them to a lost colony of ancient Greece, to the mythical city of Atlantis, to anyone at all, other than the Yoruba people who had been living in Ife for over 1,000 years. This was not a fringe view. This was mainstream European scholarship, and it tells you everything you need to know about the ideological function of African erasure. The Ife sculptures, which date from approximately the 12th to 15th centuries CE, are now universally recognized as among the greatest achievements in the entire history of human art. They are held in the collections of the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and major institutions worldwide. They are praised as technically comparable to the best of Renaissance Europe. Their creators were the Yoruba civilization, one of the most sophisticated in West African history, centered on the sacred city of Ile-Ife, believed in Yoruba cosmology to be the birthplace of all humanity, and the point from which the Orishas descended to create the world. The Kingdom of Benin, closely related in artistic tradition, produced the famous Benin bronzes, over 3,000 intricately cast plaques and sculptures documenting the royal court, military campaigns, trade, ritual, and daily life of the Benin Kingdom from the 13th century onward. They are, in essence, an illustrated visual history of an entire civilization. In 1897, a British punitive expedition, sent in response to a Benin delegation that had been ambushed and killed, though the full circumstances remain disputed, sacked the city of Benin, killed thousands of its citizens, exiled its Oba, and looted the royal palace of its entire bronze collection, Those bronzes were distributed among British soldiers as war trophies, sold to private collectors, and eventually deposited in museums across Europe. The British Museum alone holds over 900 of them. Nigeria has been requesting their return for decades. As of today, the conversation continues, and the bronzes largely remain in London. In the south of the African continent, in the country that would eventually take its name from this very site, stand the ruins of one of the most remarkable structures ever built, Great Zimbabwe. The Great Enclosure is a circular wall approximately 11 meters high and over 250 meters in circumference, built from over 1 million shaped granite blocks, fitted together without mortar, without cement, held in place entirely by the precision of their construction. In 1,000 years, not a single wall has collapsed under its own structure. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which later evolved into the Mutapa Empire. It controlled the gold trade of the Zimbabwean plateau, gold that flowed to the Swahili coast, and from there to Arabia, India, and China. Chinese porcelain found in its ruins confirms direct or indirect trade with East Asia. When European settlers arrived in what became Rhodesia in the late 19th century, they were confronted with physical evidence of a great indigenous civilization that their ideology told them could not exist. Their solution was simple: deny it. Rhodesian colonial authorities passed laws making it illegal to publish or promote the idea that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Bantu-speaking Africans. A government archaeologist was fired for concluding, based on the evidence, that it was. An American journalist who reported the African origins was banned from the country. It was only after Zimbabwe's independence in 1980 and the country's choice to name itself after this very monument that the African origins of Great Zimbabwe became the official, uncontested historical record. The monument was always African. It took a revolution to be allowed to say so. After the Mali Empire declined in the mid-14th century, it was eventually succeeded by the Songhai Empire, which became the largest empire in West African history, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to what is now northern Nigeria and Niger in the east. Under its greatest ruler, Askia Muhammad, who came to power in 1493, 1 year after Columbus landed in the Americas, the Songhai Empire reached its zenith. Askia Muhammad was an administrator of extraordinary sophistication. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He established professional judges independent from the military. He organized a banking system. He ran a professional civil service. Timbuktu, under Songhai rule, became the greatest center of Islamic scholarship in the world. Its scholars wrote extensively on theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history. One of the most important historical documents of West Africa, the Tariq al-Sudan, or Chronicle of the Sudan, was written by Songhai scholars in Timbuktu in the 17th century. It is a detailed, sophisticated account of West African history, written by Africans, for Africans. It is rarely cited in Western histories of Africa, because citing it would require acknowledging that Africans were writing their own detailed, accurate histories at a time when most of Europe's populations were illiterate. We have covered only a fraction of what exists. We have not spoken of the Zulu kingdom, whose military strategy defeated the British army at Isandlwana in 1879, one of the worst defeats the British ever suffered. We have not spoken of the Mossi kingdoms, who resisted the Songhai Empire for centuries. We have not spoken of the Oyo Empire, which at its height in the 18th century controlled a territory larger than Great Britain. We have not spoken of the Ashanti Confederacy, whose gold-enriched court produced art of extraordinary sophistication and whose army fought the British to a standstill 4 times. These are not myths. These are not romanticized inventions. These are documented, archaeologically confirmed, historically attested civilizations built by African people for African people, long before a single European ship appeared on the horizon. The erasure of African history was never an accident. It was a project, a deliberate, sustained, institutionalized effort to strip an entire people of their past, because a people who do not know where they come from are easier to control, easier to exploit, and easier to convince that they have no claim to dignity or self-determination. Understanding this history is not about anger or victimhood. It is about accuracy. It is about restoring the full picture of human history. Because African history is not a subcategory of world history. African history is the foundation of world history. Now, I want to know, which of these kingdoms hit hardest for you? Which one are you going to go and research further? Which one did you already know? And which one completely blindsided you? Tell me in the comments. This community is for learning, and your knowledge belongs here too. If this video showed you something real, please share it, subscribe, hit the notification bell. And if you have not watched last week's episode on why Africa has so many languages and tribes, that link is right there. Start from the beginning. Build the full picture.